I was never one to believe in the supernatural. Ghost stories, urban legends, and paranormal tales were just that, stories. But something changed the day I stumbled upon that post on Reddit. It was a late night, the kind where the silence in your room feels heavy, almost suffocating. I was browsing through some of the darker subreddits, a guilty pleasure of mine, when I found a thread that immediately caught my attention. The title was simple, yet it sent a chill down my spine. The light that fell from the sky. The post was written by someone who claimed to have witnessed something inexplicable as a child. They described it as a moment that shattered their sense of reality, something they could never forget, even years later. As I read through the post, I could feel a strange tension building in my chest, a tightness that made it hard to breathe. The words on the screen seemed to pull me in, as if the story itself had a grip on my soul. The author recounted a night much like the one I was experiencing, quiet, still, with an eerie calm in the air. They were only 12 years old at the time, playing outside with a group of friends near their grandmother's isolated house, which sat on the edge of a dense, dark forest. The kind of place where the trees seemed to whisper secrets in the wind, and the shadows stretched just a little too far. As they sat in a circle, laughing and chatting, something strange happened. The laughter died down as one of the kids pointed up at the sky. At first, they all thought it was a shooting star, a rare but exciting sight. But as the light grew brighter and closer, they realized this was no star. The light descended rapidly, transforming from a distant glow into a large, glowing orb. It was the size of a beach ball, but it radiated a strange, yellowish light with a blinding white core. The air around it seemed to hum with an unnatural energy, a low vibrating sound that they felt deep in their bones. And then it hit the ground right in front of them with a loud, metallic thud. The sound reverberated through the still night, echoing off the trees. The orb didn't shatter or roll away as they expected. Instead, it bounced, as if it were made of some unearthly rubber, emitting a sharp, eerie bowing that seemed to hang in the air. The kids were frozen in place, their eyes wide with shock and terror, as the orb hovered for a split second before shooting off into the forest with impossible speed, disappearing into the blackness without a trace. For a moment, there was silence. No one moved, no one spoke. It was as if the world had stopped turning, leaving them suspended in that horrifying moment. But the silence was quickly broken by the frantic whispers and shouts of the kids as they scrambled to their feet, hearts pounding in their chests. They all rushed into the woods, desperate to find whatever it was that had just invaded their world. But no matter how hard they looked, they found nothing. No scorch marks, no broken branches, not even a footprint. It was as if the orb had never existed, a phantom in the night that had left them questioning their own sanity. As I finished reading, I sat back in my chair, my heart racing. The post ended abruptly with the author confessing that they still had nightmares about that night, that the memory of the light had haunted them ever since. There were no answers, no explanations, just a lingering sense of dread that something out there, something beyond our understanding, had touched their lives in a way they could never escape. I should have stopped there. I should have closed my laptop, turned off the lights, and forced myself to forget the story. But I didn't. Something about it gnawed at me, a dark curiosity that I couldn't shake. I found myself scrolling through the comments, looking for more details, more stories like it. And that's when I made the decision that would change everything. I decided to investigate the story for myself, to find out if there was any truth to this terrifying tale. Little did I know by doing so, I was about to open a door to something far more sinister than I could ever imagine. As I delved deeper into the story, I knew that if I was going to share this experience, certain precautions had to be taken. The more I researched, the more I realized how dangerous this investigation could become. The story I had found wasn't just an eerie tale. It was a gateway to something far darker. To protect myself and others involved, I decided to change the names of everyone connected to the events. This wasn't just about anonymity. It was about survival. I began by altering the names of the kids in the original Reddit post. The author had referred to them by their real names, but I knew that these details had to be obscured. The atmosphere of the story was already steeped in fear and mystery, and this added layer of protection only deepened the sense of unease. I chose names that felt distant, detached, like shadows of the real people they represented. But as I typed out each new name, a chill ran down my spine, as if I was somehow summoning the presence of the original individuals, pulling them closer into my life. The protagonist of the original story was now Alex, a name that felt cold and impersonal. The sibling became Sam, a name that seemed to blend into the background, easy to forget, yet impossible to ignore. The other kids were given names like Jamie, Chris, and Ella, names that felt generic, almost lifeless, yet each one carried a weight that pressed down on my chest. It was as if these names weren't just random choices, but had been whispered to me by the story itself, as if the tale was alive, guiding me through its dark labyrinth. But it wasn't just the names that changed. As I wrote, the story seemed to shift in subtle ways. Details that were clear in the original post became murky, shrouded in shadows. The glowing orb, once described with eerie precision, now felt more abstract, as if it were a living nightmare that defied clear definition. The forest, too, took on a life of its own. No longer just a backdrop, it seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, the trees whispering secrets in a language I couldn't understand. The changes I made felt necessary, but with each alteration, I felt the story slipping further from my control. It was as if, by trying to protect the identities of those involved, I was also unraveling the thin veil that kept the horror contained. The more I wrote, the more the lines between fiction and reality began to blur. I started having nightmares, vivid and terrifying, where I was no longer just the writer, but a participant in the story. In these dreams, I was one of the kids, standing in that dark forest, staring up at the sky as the glowing orb descended with a menacing hum. Each night the dreams grew more intense, more real. I would wake up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding, the echo of that metallic thud ringing in my ears. It was as if the story was alive, feeding off my fear, growing stronger with each word I typed. The names I had changed began to haunt me. Alex, Sam, Jamie. They became more than just placeholders. They became real people in my mind, with faces I could almost see, voices I could almost hear. But the most disturbing part was the feeling that I was no longer alone. As I sat at my desk late at night, typing away in the dim glow of my screen, I started to sense a presence in the room with me. At first, it was just a vague unease, a feeling of being watched, but soon it became more tangible. I would catch movement out of the corner of my eye, shadows that shouldn't be there. The air would grow cold, and I'd hear faint whispers just beyond the edge of my hearing, as if the characters I had created were trying to reach out to me, to warn me, or perhaps to pull me into their world. I tried to shake it off as paranoia, a result of spending too many hours immersed in a story that was becoming all too real. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. The names, the identities I had altered, weren't just changes to protect the people involved. They were changes that had somehow disrupted the natural order of things. The story didn't want to be altered, and it was fighting back, resisting my attempts to control it. I began to regret my decision, but it was too late. The story had taken on a life of its own, and it wasn't going to let me go. I realized then that by changing the names, I hadn't just protected the identities of the original people, I had also invited something dark and ancient into my own life, something that was now watching, waiting, and growing stronger with each passing day. And as I continued to write, the terror that had once belonged to those kids in the story began to seep into my own life, turning my every waking moment into a nightmare from which there was no escape. As I continued to piece together the story, I became obsessed with the clues left behind in that Reddit post. The original author had mentioned a specific location, a remote stretch of road that bordered the dense forest where the mysterious orb had vanished. They also spoke of an old, abandoned house that stood at the edge of the woods, a place rumored to be cursed, where strange lights had been seen before. It was all too intriguing to ignore, and despite the growing sense of dread gnawing at me, I felt compelled to investigate further. The deeper I dug, the more the lines between my online research and reality began to blur. I started with a simple search for the location mentioned in the post, but what I found only deepened the mystery. There were barely any references to the area, as if it had been wiped from most public records. The few mentions I did find were buried in obscure forums and blogs, all recounting strange and unsettling events, disappearances, unexplained phenomena, sightings of glowing orbs similar to the one described in the Reddit post. But the strangest part was the way these websites would behave. Each time I tried to access one, my computer would freeze, the screen flickering ominously, as if something or someone was trying to prevent me from uncovering the truth. When I finally managed to load the pages, they were filled with distorted images and garbled text, almost as if they were corrupted by the very content they hosted. The more I tried to dig deeper, the more resistant my computer became, as if it was being controlled by an unseen force that didn't want me to proceed. And then the messages started. At first, they appeared as pop-up notifications, short, cryptic sentences that would flash on my screen for a split second before disappearing too fast for me to take a screenshot, turn back, stop before it's too late. You're not alone. Each message sent a jolt of fear through me, my hands trembling as I tried to rationalize what was happening. It had to be a glitch, some kind of malware, I told myself, but deep down I knew it was something more sinister. As the days passed, the messages became more frequent and more disturbing. They no longer just appeared on my computer, they began to show up in other places too. My phone would buzz with a notification, only for me to see a text from an unknown number saying, "They're watching you." When I checked my email, I would find messages in my inbox that I had no memory of sending, their subjects cryptic and foreboding, like, "You can't escape," or "It's already too late." The senders were always anonymous, their email addresses a string of nonsensical characters that made it impossible to trace. The most chilling moment came one night when I was working late, the room dark except for the glow of my screen. I was scrolling through a particularly obscure forum thread when my speakers suddenly crackled to life. A low, humming sound filled the room, vibrating through my bones. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest as I realized the sound was coming from the computer, from the very site I was on. The hum grew louder, more intense, as if something was trying to push its way through the screen to reach out and pull me in. And then I heard it. A voice. Faint at first, but growing clearer with each word. It was distorted, as though filtered through a layer of static, but I could make out what it was saying. "You shouldn't have come this far. You're not safe." The voice was cold, devoid of any emotion, and it seemed to echo in the room around me, as if it were coming from the walls themselves. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead, my hands gripping the edge of the desk as I fought the urge to shut off the computer and run. But something kept me rooted to the spot, a morbid curiosity that refused to let me turn away. The voice continued, growing more insistent, more threatening. "They know what you've done. They're coming for you." I felt my breath hitch in my throat. What had I done to attract their attention? My rational mind screamed at me to stop, to walk away, but the fear held me in its grip, paralyzing me with the weight of the unknown. As the voice faded, the screen suddenly went black, plunging the room into darkness. For a moment, there was nothing. Just the sound of my own ragged breathing in the pitch-black silence. Then, without warning, the screen flickered back on, displaying an image that made my blood run cold. It was a photo of the abandoned house mentioned in the Reddit post. But it wasn't just any photo. It was taken from outside my own window. The realization hit me like a freight train. Someone or something had been outside my home watching me. The terror that had been simmering beneath the surface now boiled over, flooding my senses. I spun around, eyes darting to the window, but all I could see was my own reflection, pale and terrified, staring back at me. The room was silent again, but the weight of the darkness pressed down on me, suffocating, as if the very air had thickened with dread. I shut down the computer, hands shaking uncontrollably. I couldn't sleep that night. Every creak of the house, every rustle of leaves outside sent my heart racing, my mind conjuring images of faceless figures lurking just beyond the window. The story that had once seemed like a simple online mystery had now become something far more real and far more terrifying. The line between the digital world and reality had been crossed, and there was no going back. I was no longer just an observer. I was a participant, drawn into a nightmare that refused to let go. And as I lay there in the darkness, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was out there, whatever had been watching me, was still out there, waiting for the right moment to make its move. The first night it happened, I was alone in my apartment. The kind of quiet where even the sound of your own breathing feels intrusive. The events from earlier in the day had left me on edge, but I tried to convince myself it was all just an elaborate coincidence, a series of strange but explainable occurrences. I was wrong. It was past midnight, and I was sitting at my desk, trying to focus on anything but the creeping dread that had settled in the back of my mind. The only light in the room came from my desk lamp, casting long shadows that seemed to move ever so slightly when I wasn't looking directly at them. I told myself it was just the flicker of the bulb, nothing more. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I was typing up some notes when it happened. At first, it was just a feeling, a subtle shift in the atmosphere. The air around me grew colder, like the temperature had dropped several degrees in an instant. I shivered, pulling my jacket tighter around me, but the chill seemed to seep into my bones, making it impossible to get warm. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and I had the distinct sensation that I was no longer alone. I tried to brush it off, to focus on the task at hand, but my fingers trembled over the keyboard, unable to type another word. My eyes were drawn to the corner of the room, where the shadows seemed darker, deeper than they should have been. There was something there, just out of sight, something that made my heart race and my breath catch in my throat. I felt it before I saw it, the oppressive weight of a presence, cold and malevolent, pressing down on me from all sides. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it, a shadow, darker than the rest, moving slowly across the wall. My breath hitched as I turned my head, my eyes locked on the spot where the shadow should have been. But there was nothing there, just the blank wall, the same as it had always been. I exhaled, trying to calm my racing heart, but the unease remained, a nagging doubt that gnawed at the edges of my mind. I tried to return to my work, but the sense of dread only grew stronger. My eyes kept drifting back to that same spot, and each time, I was certain I'd catch a glimpse of something just out of sight. It was as if the shadows themselves were watching me, waiting for the right moment to step into the light. I could feel the weight of their gaze, heavy and suffocating, as though the darkness was alive, pulsing with a sinister intent. The silence in the room became deafening, pressing in on my ears until it felt like my head would burst from the pressure. I strained to hear something, anything, that would break the tension. But the quiet was unrelenting, a void that swallowed every sound. And then, just as I thought I couldn't bear it any longer, I heard it, a faint, barely perceptible whisper. The voice was low, almost guttural, and it seemed to come from everywhere at once. It was a sound that didn't belong in this world, something ancient and filled with malice. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. This was a warning, a threat. I froze, my body paralyzed with fear as the whispering grew louder, more insistent. It echoed in my ears, reverberating through my skull until it was all I could hear. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the whispering stopped. The room fell deathly silent, the kind of silence that feels like the calm before a storm. I sat there, my heart pounding in my chest, waiting for the next wave of terror to crash over me. But nothing happened. The cold presence that had filled the room was gone, leaving behind only an oppressive stillness. I wanted to believe it was over, that whatever had been there had decided to leave. But I knew better. The unease, the fear that had settled deep in my bones, told me that this was just the beginning. Something had changed, something fundamental, and there was no going back to the way things were before. In the days that followed, the sense of being watched never left me. Every shadow seemed to hold a lurking presence, every unexpected sound a reminder that I was not alone. The whispering returned, sometimes in the dead of night, sometimes in the quiet moments of the day when I least expected it. It would start faint, almost like a breeze rustling through leaves, but quickly grow louder, more distinct, until it was all I could hear. I began to lose track of time, the days blending into nights as the fear and exhaustion took their toll. My apartment no longer felt like a safe haven. It had become a trap, a place where the walls closed in on me, suffocating and inescapable. The shadows grew bolder, darker and more defined, until I could no longer tell where they ended and I began. They seemed to pulse with a life of their own, creeping closer with each passing day until I felt like I was being swallowed whole by the darkness. I tried to tell myself it was all in my head, a result of too many sleepless nights and the stress of my research. But the more I tried to rationalize it, the more real it became. The presence in the shadows was no longer content to watch from a distance. It was getting closer, more tangible, until I could feel its breath on the back of my neck, cold and sharp like the edge of a knife. And then, one night, it finally made contact. I was lying in bed, the covers pulled up to my chin, trying to will myself to sleep. The room was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the street lamp outside my window. I had just started to drift off when I felt it, a pressure on the mattress beside me, as if someone had just sat down. My eyes snapped open, my heart leaping into my throat as I stared into the darkness. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel it. Something was there, sitting right beside me. The air around me grew colder, and I felt a prickling sensation on the back of my neck, like 1,000 tiny needles pressing into my skin. I tried to move, to turn on the light, but my body refused to obey. I was paralyzed, trapped in a waking nightmare, unable to do anything but lie there and wait for whatever was coming next. And then the whispering returned, but this time it was different. It wasn't coming from the walls or the shadows. It was right beside me, so close that I could feel the breath of the words against my ear. You shouldn't have looked. You shouldn't have seen. The voice was cold, devoid of any warmth or humanity, and it sent a wave of terror crashing through me. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't move, couldn't make a sound. I was trapped, frozen in place by the sheer force of my fear. The pressure on the mattress increased, as if the presence was leaning closer, pressing its weight down on me. I could feel its breath, icy and foul, against my cheek, and the smell of decay filled my nostrils, making me gag. The whispering continued, growing louder, more insistent, until it was all I could hear. You've seen too much. You can't go back. The voice was relentless, hammering the words into my skull, driving me to the brink of madness. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The presence lifted, the pressure on the mattress disappeared, and I was alone again. I gasped for breath, my body shaking uncontrollably as the paralysis finally released its grip on me. I reached out with trembling hands to turn on the light, but the moment the room was bathed in its warm glow, I saw nothing. No shadow, no figure, nothing to explain what had just happened. But I knew what I had felt, what I had heard. The terror was real, and it had marked me. I wasn't safe, not in my own home, not anywhere. Something had crossed over from the shadows, something malevolent and ancient, and it wasn't going to let me go. The fear that had taken root in my heart was only the beginning, the first taste of the horror that was yet to come. And as I sat there, bathed in the full safety of the light, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still out there, lurking just beyond the edges of the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike again. The days that followed were a descent into madness. The sense of dread that had begun as a whisper in the back of my mind now screamed at me with every waking moment. My life, once filled with the mundane comfort of routine, was now a constant battle against an unseen force that seemed determined to break me. The boundaries between reality and nightmare were no longer clear, and I found myself trapped in a world where fear was the only certainty. It started with the shadows. They grew bolder, darker, and more defined, as if the darkness itself had taken on a life of its own. No longer content to lurk in the corners of my vision, they began to move with purpose, creeping closer whenever I turned my back. At first, I would catch them sliding across the walls, a flicker of movement that would disappear the moment I turned to look. But soon, they became more aggressive, more tangible. I could feel them pressing in on me, cold and suffocating, their presence undeniable. One night as I sat at my desk trying to work, I noticed something out of place. The shadow cast by my lamp seemed wrong. It was too dark, too solid, as if it had substance, weight. My breath caught in my throat as I watched it slowly stretch across the desk, reaching out like a living thing. It stopped just short of my hand, hovering there as if waiting for me to make the next move. My heart pounded in my chest, the room suddenly feeling too small, too claustrophobic. I bolted from my chair, knocking it over in my haste to get away, but the shadow remained, lingering on the desk like a stain that wouldn't wash away. The next day, the strange occurrences escalated. I began to find things in my apartment moved, small objects out of place, doors that I was certain I had closed left wide open. The air was thick with an oppressive energy, a constant reminder that I was no longer alone in my own home. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind outside set my nerves on edge. Sleep became impossible. My nights spent wide awake, eyes scanning the dark corners of my room for the lurking shadows that I knew were there, waiting. The messages returned as well, more frequent and more disturbing than before. They were no longer confined to my computer or phone. I began finding them in the real world, scrawled in places they had no business being. On the bathroom mirror, written in the steam after a shower, "You're not safe." Scribbled on the pages of a book I had left open on the coffee table. "They're watching." Even on the wall of my bedroom, scratched into the paint with something sharp, "There's no escape." Each message left me more shaken than the last, a creeping terror that gnawed at my sanity. But it wasn't just the messages. I started hearing things, voices that whispered my name in the dead of night, just as I was drifting off to sleep. They were faint at first, almost indistinguishable from the rustling of leaves outside my window, but they grew louder, more distinct, until I couldn't ignore them any longer. They called to me, taunted me, their tone dripping with malice. "We see you. We know what you did. It's too late now." The voices would come from nowhere and everywhere at once, surrounding me, filling the room with their chilling presence. One evening, as I was preparing dinner, I heard a crash from the living room. My heart skipped a beat, the knife slipping from my hand and clattering onto the counter as I rushed to see what had happened. The room was a mess. Books and papers strewn across the floor. The coffee table overturned, the lamp shattered into pieces. But what froze me in place was the sight of the words written on the wall in what looked like thick, dark red paint. "You're next." My blood ran cold, and I stumbled backward, my mind racing with terror. I didn't want to believe it, but the truth was undeniable. Whatever was haunting me was no longer content with just scaring me. It was coming for me, and it was only a matter of time before it made its move. I tried to clean the wall, to scrub away the message, but no matter how hard I scrubbed, the words remained, a constant reminder of the doom that awaited me. My hands shook with fear, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps as I realized the full extent of my situation. I was being hunted, stalked by something that had no physical form but was more dangerous than any living creature. The knowledge weighed heavily on me, dragging me deeper into despair with each passing day. As the days turned into weeks, the terror only grew worse. I became a prisoner in my own home, too terrified to leave, yet equally terrified to stay. I stopped answering the phone, stopped checking my email, convinced that every ring, every ding was another message from whatever was tormenting me. I was losing touch with reality, the world outside my apartment fading into a distant memory as I became consumed by the horror that now ruled my life. The shadows, the voices, the messages, they were all a part of it. A relentless assault on my sanity designed to break me down, to make me vulnerable. And it was working. I could feel myself unraveling, the fear eating away at my mind like a disease, spreading through every thought, every action. I was no longer in control. Something else was, something dark and malevolent that had wormed its way into my life and wasn't going to leave until it had taken everything from me. And then came the night when the horror reached its peak. I was lying in bed, the covers pulled up to my chin, trying to force myself to sleep despite the overwhelming fear that had become my constant companion. The room was dark, save for the faint glow of the streetlight outside, casting eerie shadows across the walls. I just closed my eyes when I felt it, a cold breath on the back of my neck, sending a jolt of terror through me. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest, too afraid to move, to even breathe. Then I heard it. The voice, louder and clearer than ever before, whispering directly into my ear. "It's time." The words sent a wave of cold dread crashing over me, and I knew, without a doubt, that this was the end. Whatever had been tormenting me was finally going to make its move, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. I lay there, paralyzed with fear, as the room seemed to close in around me. The shadows grew darker, deeper, until they were no longer just shadows. They were figures looming over me, their faces obscured by the darkness. I could feel their eyes on me, watching, waiting, as the voice whispered again, "You can't escape." I tried to scream, to fight, but my body refused to obey, locked in place by a terror so overwhelming it felt like my very soul was being crushed. And then, everything went black. When I woke up, I was lying on the floor, my body cold and stiff, as if I had been there for hours. The room was empty, the shadows gone, but the sense of dread remained heavier than ever. I knew that whatever had happened that night was just the beginning. The horror wasn't over, it was only just beginning. The fear that had been a constant presence in my life was now something much worse, a living, breathing entity that had taken root in my very soul. It was no longer just an external force tormenting me. It had become a part of me, a darkness that I couldn't escape no matter how hard I tried. And as I sat there alone in the cold light of dawn, I realized that there was no escaping the horror that had taken hold of my life. It was inside me now, a part of me, and it wasn't going to let me go until it had consumed everything I was, everything I ever would be. The escalation was complete. The terror had taken over, and there was no going back. The truth hit me like a cold, hard slap. It was a revelation so horrific, so twisted, that it took everything I had to keep from breaking down right then and there. The nightmare I was living wasn't just the result of some random malevolent force. No, this was something far more sinister, something that had been planned, orchestrated from the very beginning. I wasn't just a victim. I had been chosen, targeted by something ancient and evil that thrived on fear and despair. It started with a discovery, something buried deep in the original Reddit post that I had somehow overlooked. The author had mentioned, almost in passing, that their family had long been plagued by strange occurrences, incidents that defied explanation. At the time, it seemed like nothing more than a bit of background, a detail to add to the story's atmosphere. But now, in the cold light of everything I had experienced, it took on a new, terrifying significance. I spent days obsessively combing through the post, looking for anything I might have missed. That's when I found it, a single, cryptic sentence buried in the comments, written by someone claiming to know more about the events described. It was vague, almost nonsensical, but it sent a chill down my spine. The curse isn't bound by blood alone. It spreads through those who seek it. The words seemed to leap off the screen, their meaning hitting me with the force of a physical blow. I realized, with dawning horror, that by investigating the story, by seeking out the truth, I had invited the curse into my own life. But it wasn't just a curse. It was something far worse, a pact made long ago by desperate souls who sought power and revenge at the cost of their own humanity. The original story, the one about the mysterious light that fell from the sky, was just the surface. Beneath it was a history steeped in darkness, in rituals and sacrifices that defied belief. The glowing orb wasn't just a supernatural anomaly. It was a manifestation, a beacon that marked the presence of something far more dangerous. The more I dug, the more I uncovered. The abandoned house near the forest, the one the Reddit post had mentioned, wasn't just a place of legend. It had a real, documented history, one filled with disappearances, tragic accidents, and violent deaths. And at the center of it all was a family, the same family the original poster had come from, who had lived there for generations, each one more cursed than the last. The deeper I went, the darker the story became. It wasn't just a tale of a haunted house or a cursed family. It was the story of a deal with something not of this world, something that had been summoned through forbidden rituals and dark magic. The light, the orb that had terrorized those children, was a harbinger, a sign that the pact had been fulfilled. It marked the beginning of a cycle of terror that would spread to anyone who dared to investigate, to uncover the truth. And I had walked right into it. The realization was like a knife to the gut. All the strange occurrences, the shadows, the voices, the feeling of being watched, they weren't random. They were all part of the curse. A curse that had been passed on to me the moment I began digging into the story. By trying to uncover the truth, I had unknowingly sealed my fate, becoming the latest victim in a long line of those who had sought answers only to find horror instead. But the worst part was yet to come. As I continued my research, I found records, old newspaper clippings, and personal journals that spoke of the curse's true nature. It wasn't just about fear or suffering. Those were merely the tools it used to break down its victims. The curse was designed to consume, to devour the very essence of those it targeted, feeding on their terror until there was nothing left. It was a parasite, one that thrived on pain and despair, and it had latched onto me with a hunger that couldn't be sated. One journal in particular stood out, a faded, leather-bound book that had belonged to a woman who lived in the house nearly a century ago. Her words were filled with fear and desperation, describing the same events I'd been experiencing, the same descent into madness. But as I read further, I found something that made my blood run cold. She spoke of a ritual, one that could break the curse, but at a terrible cost. The ritual required a sacrifice, a willing offering to the dark forces that had created the curse in the first place. Without it, she wrote, the curse would continue, spreading to anyone who tried to stop it. Her final entry was short, written in a shaky hand, as if she had been too weak to write more. I couldn't do it. I couldn't make the sacrifice. Now they have come for me, and there is no escape. God forgive me. The page was stained as if by tears or something darker, and it ended abruptly, leaving me with a sinking feeling in my gut. She had failed, and now I was faced with the same choice. The weight of the revelation pressed down on me, suffocating in its intensity. I was trapped, caught in a web of horror that had been spun long before I was born, a victim of a curse that fed on my fear and grew stronger with each passing day. The shadows, the voices, they were just the beginning. The real terror, the full weight of the curse was yet to come, and I knew, deep in my bones, that there was only one way out. But could I do it? Could I make the sacrifice, give up a part of myself to stop the curse? Or would I, like the woman in the journal, falter at the last moment, allowing the darkness to consume me entirely? The thought gnawed at me, a constant presence that made it impossible to think of anything else. The fear was no longer just in the shadows or the whispers. It was in me, a part of me, growing stronger with each passing moment. I was running out of time. The curse was closing in, and I had to make a choice. Face the darkness and do what needed to be done, or let it take me, body and soul, into the abyss. The revelation had shown me the truth, but it had also sealed my fate. The terror was no longer just external. It was inside me, a living, breathing entity that wouldn't rest until it had devoured everything I was. And as I sat there, alone in the darkness, I knew that there was no escaping the horror that had been unleashed. The curse had claimed me, and it wasn't going to let go until it had taken everything. The night of the final confrontation was unlike any other. There was a heaviness in the air, a sense of impending doom that made it difficult to breathe. The shadows that had once lurked in the corners of my vision now filled every inch of my apartment, creeping along the walls, slithering across the floor, and coiling around the furniture like living tendrils of darkness. It was as if the very fabric of reality was unraveling, consumed by the curse that had taken root in my life. I had prepared as best I could, armed with the knowledge from the journals and the rituals they described, but no amount of preparation could have steeled me for what was to come. The curse had grown stronger, feeding on my fear, my despair, until it had become a force of nature, unstoppable and malevolent. And now it had come to claim what it was owed. The ritual was supposed to be simple, in theory. A circle of salt, a few candles, and the recitation of ancient words meant to bind the darkness, to contain it long enough for the sacrifice to be made. But as I stood in the center of that circle, clutching the old journal in one trembling hand, I could feel the power of the curse pressing down on me, suffocating in its intensity. The air around me crackled with energy, and the shadows seemed to pulse with a life of their own, growing thicker, darker, as if they were closing in, ready to engulf me. I began the incantation, my voice trembling, barely above a whisper. The words felt foreign on my tongue, twisted and dark, as if they had been pulled from the very depths of the abyss. Each syllable seemed to echo through the room, reverberating off the walls with a strange, unnatural resonance. The shadows reacted instantly, writhing and twisting as if in pain, but they did not retreat. Instead, they grew more frantic, more desperate, as though they knew what was coming and would do anything to stop it. As I reached the end of the incantation, the room was plunged into an even deeper darkness. The candles flickered and died, their flames snuffed out by an unseen force. The circle of salt, my last line of defense, began to shift, as if something was trying to breach its boundary, to break through and claim me. I could feel the presence in the room grow stronger, more oppressive, and a cold sweat broke out across my skin as I realized I was losing control. And then, the voices returned, louder and more insistent than ever before. They filled the room, overlapping and intertwining in a cacophony of sound that drowned out everything else. You cannot stop us. You will suffer. It's too late. The words pounded in my head, driving spikes of terror into my mind, making it impossible to think, to focus. I pressed my hands to my ears, trying to block them out, but it was no use. The voices were inside my head, and they weren't going to stop until they had broken me completely. In the midst of the chaos, I realized with dawning horror that the ritual had failed. The shadows were no longer just figures in the darkness. They had taken on form, shape, becoming monstrous, grotesque things that clawed their way toward me, their eyes glowing with a malevolent light. They were the embodiment of the curse, the physical manifestation of the darkness that had consumed my life. And they were coming for me. I tried to back away, to retreat to the center of the circle, but my feet felt like lead, my body weighed down by an invisible force. The shadows closed in, their twisted forms looming over me, their breath cold and foul on my skin. I could see their faces now, distorted and nightmarish, twisted into expressions of pure hatred and rage. They reached out with clawed hands, their touch icy, and I felt a wave of despair wash over me as I realized there was no escape. The ritual had failed, and I was trapped. But then, in the midst of my terror, a thought struck me. A desperate, last-ditch realization that sent a jolt of adrenaline through my veins. The journals had spoken of a sacrifice, a final, irrevocable act that could bind the darkness, but only if it was made willingly, with full knowledge of the cost. I had read those words over and over, but I had never fully understood them until now. The curse wasn't just a force of evil. It was a contract, a pact that demanded payment in exchange for release. And the price it demanded was something I had never considered: my own life. The realization hit me like a physical blow, but there was no time to dwell on it. The shadows were closing in, their claws inches from my skin, and I knew that if I didn't act now, I would be lost forever, consumed by the darkness. With a surge of resolve, I reached into the circle and grabbed the knife I'd prepared. The knife that had belonged to the woman in the journal, the one she had been too afraid to use. The shadows hesitated, as if sensing what I was about to do. The voices grew frantic, screaming in my ears, begging me to stop, to think, to reconsider, but I knew it was too late for that. The curse had taken everything from me, my peace, my sanity, my very soul. And I wasn't going to let it win. Not like this. With a deep breath, I raised the knife, feeling the weight of it in my hand, the cold steel against my skin. The shadows recoiled, their forms flickering and wavering, as if they knew what was coming. The room seemed to vibrate with tension, the air thick with the stench of decay and fear. My heart pounded in my chest, but my mind was clear, my resolve unshakable. I whispered the final words of the ritual, the words that would bind the darkness, and then, with a swift, determined motion, I plunged the knife into my own chest. The pain was immediate, sharp and searing, but it was nothing compared to the relief that flooded through me. The shadows shrieked, their forms unraveling, dissolving into wisps of smoke that were sucked into the void. The voices cut off abruptly, leaving a silence so profound it was almost deafening. I could feel the curse lifting, the darkness retreating, as if it had been sated, finally satisfied with the sacrifice it had demanded. As I sank to the floor, the knife still lodged in my chest, I felt a strange sense of peace. The room was still dark, but the oppressive weight had lifted, the shadows gone, leaving only a faint, fading sense of dread. The curse had been broken, the pact fulfilled, and I had finally won. But as the darkness closed in around me, I couldn't help but wonder, had I truly won? Or had I merely delayed the inevitable, passing the curse on to someone else, some other poor soul who would stumble upon the story, just as I had, and fall into the same trap? The thought lingered in my mind as my vision began to blur, the pain in my chest fading into a dull ache. In my final moments, I realized the terrible truth. The curse could never truly be broken. It was a cycle, an endless loop of fear and despair that would continue long after I was gone. The darkness would return, seeking out a new victim, and the horror would begin again. There was no escape, not really. The curse had claimed me, and it would claim others over and over until the end of time. And as the last of my strength ebbed away, I could almost hear the voices again, faint and distant, but filled with a sense of triumph. It's not over. It's never over. And then there was only darkness. When I woke up, I wasn't dead. The first thing I felt was the cold, an icy chill that seeped into my bones. My chest throbbed with pain, the wound from the knife a dull, persistent ache. I could barely move, my limbs heavy and unresponsive, but as my eyes fluttered open, I realized with a shock that I was still in my apartment. The same room, the same walls, but everything was wrong. The once familiar surroundings were now bathed in an unnatural light, a sickly pale glow that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. The shadows, which had once tormented me with their sinister presence, were now gone, replaced by an oppressive stillness that pressed down on me like a weight. The air was thick with the stench of decay, a putrid smell that filled my nostrils and made me gag. But the most horrifying thing of all was the silence. It was complete and absolute, a void. Where sound had once been, I couldn't hear anything, not the hum of the refrigerator, not the distant sounds of the city outside, not even my own breathing. It was as if the world had been muted, silenced by a force that was beyond comprehension. I tried to sit up, but my body refused to obey. Panic set in as I realized that I was trapped, paralyzed in my own body, unable to do anything but lie there and wait. My mind raced, desperately trying to piece together what had happened, how I could still be alive after what I had done. But the more I tried to think, the more the answers slipped away, leaving me with only one terrible conclusion. I hadn't escaped. The curse hadn't been broken. It had merely changed. As I lay there, helpless and afraid, I began to hear it. A faint, rhythmic sound, like the ticking of a clock. It was distant at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew louder with each passing second, a steady, relentless rhythm that filled the room. My heart pounded in time with the ticking, each beat a painful reminder that I was still here, still trapped in this nightmare. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it, movement just at the edge of my vision. I tried to turn my head to get a better look, but my body wouldn't respond. All I could do was stare straight ahead, my heart racing as the ticking grew louder, more insistent. The movement came again, a flicker of shadow against the unnatural light, and this time I could make out a shape. It was a figure, standing just beyond the edge of my vision, shrouded in darkness. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its presence, cold, malevolent, watching me with a hunger that sent a wave of terror crashing over me. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, but I knew it was there, waiting, biding its time. The ticking continued faster now, as if marking the countdown to something terrible. The figure remained still, a dark silhouette against the pale light, and I could feel its gaze boring into me, stripping away my defenses, exposing every fear, every doubt. I wanted to scream, to beg for mercy, but no sound would come. The silence was complete, suffocating, and it was all I could do to keep from going mad. And then, slowly, the figure began to move. It took a step forward, and then another, its movement slow and deliberate, as if savoring the moment. The closer it came, the more the terror built inside me, a suffocating pressure that made it hard to breathe. I could see it more clearly now. A tall, thin figure, its body obscured by shadows that seemed to cling to it like a second skin. The air around it shimmered with a strange, unnatural energy, distorting the light and making it impossible to see its face. But as it drew nearer, I could make out something, a pair of eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. They were the color of burning embers, a deep, smoldering red that seemed to pierce through the shadows, through the silence, straight into my soul. The figure stopped just a few feet away from me, its gaze locked onto mine, and in that moment, I knew that whatever this thing was, it was the embodiment of the curse, the living manifestation of the darkness that had consumed my life. The ticking stopped. For a moment, there was only silence, a void that stretched on for what felt like an eternity. And then the figure spoke. Its voice was a low, guttural rasp, like the sound of rocks grinding together deep within the earth. It wasn't just a voice, it was a presence, a force that filled the room, pressing down on me with the weight of 1,000 nightmares. "You thought you could escape," it said, the words reverberating through my skull. "But the curse is eternal. It binds you now, as it has bound others before you." The words sent a jolt of terror through me, and I struggled to move, to fight back, but it was no use. The figure continued, its voice rising, filling the room with its malevolent power. "You made the sacrifice, but the price was never your life. It was your soul." The figure stepped closer, its eyes burning with a cruel, sadistic light. "You belong to the darkness now. You will serve it, as others have served before you, and when your time is done, you will pass the curse to another, as it has been passed to you." The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. The sacrifice hadn't freed me. It had bound me to the curse, trapping me in an eternal cycle of horror. I was no longer just a victim. I was a part of the curse, a servant of the darkness, doomed to spread the terror to others, to pass on the nightmare to those who would come after me. The figure reached out, its hand hovering just above my chest, where the wound from the knife still throbbed with pain. I could feel the cold emanating from it, a chill that seeped into my very bones, freezing me from the inside out. The figure's eyes burned brighter, and I could see its face now, gaunt, skeletal, with skin stretched tight over bone and a mouth twisted into a cruel, mocking smile. "You will serve," it said. And with that, it pressed its hand down onto my chest, the cold searing into my flesh like fire. I screamed, the sound finally ripping free from my throat, but it was swallowed by the silence, by the darkness that surrounded me. The pain was unbearable, a burning, searing agony that tore through my body, through my soul, as the curse took hold, binding me to it for eternity. "Ambistan ständig in dessa, och säger sig tusen okej, nittade dradenda,